Hey, what's up, guys? How you guys doing? Let me know if you guys can hear me, and let's do a Q&A. Let's do a Q&A, quick Q&A. So, let's see if people join. I'm testing out the new microphone. So let's see if people have any questions, comments, concerns. Let me know in the live chat. So let's see if we can get some people on and see if I can answer some questions. Hey, what's up, guys? How you guys doing? Let me know if you guys can hear me, and let's do a Q&A. Let's do a Q&A, quick Q&A. So, let's see if people join. I'm testing out the new microphone. So let's see if people have any questions, comments, concerns. Let me know in the live chat. So let's see if we can get some people on and see if I can answer some questions. If you guys got questions, let me know in the chat. Let me know in the little chat. I'll put it on screen, and we will go from there. It's Mountain Dew Baja Blast. So it's Mountain Dew Baja Blast. So, ask your questions. I will answer. So any questions you got, put it in the chat, and I will put it on screen. So let's see those questions or comments or concerns. Nope. Orthodox Muslim.
All right, so let's see those questions, guys. Got any questions? Or comments? Doesn't matter. Let's see it on the chat function. Hey, can you put questions and comments on the screen on YouTube? I know you can do that with StreamYard, but can you do that on YouTube? Let me know if I can put the comments or questions on the screen here, because I want to do that, but I don't see any way to do that. Cool. Are you mostly interested in debate and discussion with Christians? Yeah, I think I am. Yeah, just I mean, I'm willing to look into Judaism, Hinduism, atheism, Buddhism, whatever, Jainism. But the focus of this channel is to refute Christian and Christian apologists. So that's what this channel mainly. I mean, this channel deals with Islam too, but it mainly deals with refuting the Bible, etc. Jesus didn't preach Christianity. Exactly. He preached the Mosaic law and he preached a form of Judaism. Just read Matthew chapter 5, verse 17 to 19. Read the Gospel of Luke. Read the Gospel of John, where Jesus says the Scripture can't be broken. So if you read the Gospels of Matthew, Luke, Jesus taught the Mosaic law. He said, all heaven and earth can pass away, but the letter of the law is to remain intact in the Gospel of Matthew and Luke. So if you read those Gospels, Jesus preached the Mosaic law. Paul gets rid of the Mosaic law. So who are you gonna listen to, Jesus or Paul? Because Jesus taught the Mosaic law, while Paul gets rid of the law. Abraham and Moses didn't worship Jesus as God. Yeah, exactly. They worshipped one Unitarian being or one Unitarian God, as the Old Testament teaches. Not a single verse exists in man-made gospels. I don't know what you mean by that, but yeah, Jesus never said, I'm God and worship me. And the reason why Jesus has to say, I am God and worship me, is because the Old Testament God says, I am God and worship me. So why doesn't Jesus repeat those same words? Very strange. If Jesus is supposed to be God, he has to repeat what the Old Testament God says. If he doesn't, that means Jesus is not God, or Jesus didn't think or identify himself as God. In fact, Jesus identified himself as a prophet several times in the Gospels of Mark, Matthew, and Luke. You just see, like Mark chapter 6, verse 4, Jesus identifies himself as a prophet. And what does Islam teach? Surprise, surprise, that Jesus is a prophet only in the Quran chapter 3, in the Quran chapter 4, in the Quran chapter 5, etc., Quran chapter 19, etc.
Paul gets rid of the Mosaic law. So who are you gonna listen to, Jesus or Paul? Because Jesus taught the Mosaic law, while Paul gets rid of the law. Abraham and Moses didn't worship Jesus as God. Yeah, exactly. They worshipped one Unitarian being, or one.
Okay, Deborah Dave says the doctrine of Jesus God doesn't seem to concur within Christianity until the Gospel of John in the late first century at the earliest. Exactly. But now, when we get to the Gospel of John, now we're talking about that. But if you read Mark, Matthew, and Luke, Jesus identifies himself as a prophet, and Jesus identifies himself as the Son of Man in Matthew and Luke. And the Son of Man in Old Testament terminology means a normal human being, not a divine being. Because if you read the book of Ezekiel, Ezekiel is identified as a son of man. So if Ezekiel is, if nobody thinks Ezekiel is like the divine son of God, or part of the Trinity, or exactly uh, part of the Trinity, et cetera, et cetera. So same thing with Jesus. When Jesus is saying, identifying himself as the Son of Man in the Gospel of Matthew and Luke, that means Jesus is identifying himself as a human, or is associating himself with humanity, with humans, and he's not, or Jesus is identifying himself as a human, and not as the Son of God, etc., not as some divine being. So exactly, you got it right, Deborah Dave. The doctrine of Jesus as God comes in the Gospel of John, which is the latest, which is the later gospel. It's the latest gospel to be written in the 90s or the hundreds, according to Christian scholars. They date the Gospel of John as coming later, and the Gospel of Mark, Matthew, and Luke don't identify Jesus as God. So you got a big problem with the synoptic Gospels, which is Mark, Matthew, and Luke, contradicting the Gospel of John. But even in John chapter 17, verse 3, Jesus identifies God as the only true God. That means Jesus is identifying Jesus is saying only God is God, and he is excluded from being, uh, part of God's essence and purpose. So Jesus is lesser than God, or Jesus is saying only God is God in Gospel of John chapter 17, verse 3. That means Jesus cannot be God. And John 17:3 contradicts the doctrine of the Trinity that says the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit are co-equal. But if God is the only God, that means the Holy Spirit and the Son can't be co-equal. Therefore, God is greater than both of these, thus disproving the Trinity according to the Greek wording of John 17:3. The Greek word is monos. Monos means only. So Jesus is saying God is the only God.
Of Mark, Matthew, and Luke. You see, like Mark chapter 6, verse 4, Jesus identifies himself as a prophet. And what does Islam teach? Surprise, surprise, that Jesus, God, etc., not as some divine being. So exactly, you got it right, Deborah Dave. The doctrine of Jesus as God comes in the Gospel of John, which is the latest, which is the later gospel. It's
Okay, so Dexter Original Sin. I heard you say you're a Orthodox Muslim. Correct me if I'm wrong. You're not wrong. I said that. Were you raised in the tradition from childhood? Yeah. And at one point, I left the religion altogether when I went to university. Then I came back to religion. So it was a strange journey for me. But after doing some research, uh, you know, staying Muslim, I think the evidence supports Islam, not really the Old Testament or New Testament or the Bible. So I think the right decision is, or if you want to follow the evidence, I think the evidence is flows in Islam's favor, not the Bible's favor, because like Bart Ehrman completely destroyed Christianity. He destroyed any kind of reliability of the New Testament, etc. As the joke goes, that Bart Ehrman is the destroyer of Christianity, and I think that's a accurate term for him. When it comes to the Old Testament has been refuted over and over. Like if you read Jeremiah chapter 8, verse 8, it's talking about the corruption of the Torah during Jeremiah's time. And if you read the book, The Bible on Earth, where they refute the claims from archaeological diggings, confirm the Old Testament, and they refute the whole idea that Moses wrote the Old Testament and all that. They show that it's impossible for Moses to have written Genesis, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Exodus, etc., as those books came at least 1,000 years after Moses supposedly lived, or whatever the time frame biblical scholars put Moses in. They say like those books, the Old Testament books, came thousands of years later written by unknown editors and unknown writers, living after the time of Moses, at least 1,000 years after Moses lived. So they go into big details on why you can't trust the Old Testament, why there's archaeological problems with the Old Testament, and why archaeology has disproven a lot of the Old Testament claims. So that's a book I would recommend, The Bible on Earth. And I would recommend Bart Ehrman's book, Jesus Interrupted, where he shows the mainstream consensus regarding New Testament studies. So those two books, The Bible on Earth and Jesus Interrupted, completely refute fundamentalist ideas about the Bible and Judaism and Christianity. So I'd recommend those books because those books really, uh, you know, uh, dig deeper into the issues, or they really talk about why you can't trust either the Old Testament and New Testament and the general problems with both those books.
after the time of Moses, at least 1,000 years after Moses lived. So they go into big details on why you can't trust the Old Testament, why there's archaeological problems with the Old Testament, and why archaeology has disproven a lot of the Old Testament claims. So that's a book I would recommend, The Bible on Earth. And I would recommend Bart Ehrman's book, Jesus Interrupted, where he shows the mainstream consensus regarding New Testament studies. So those two books, The Bible on Earth and Jesus Interrupted, completely refute fundamentalist ideas about the Bible in Judaism and Christianity. So I'd recommend those books because those books really, dig deeper into the issues, or they really talk about why you can't trust either the Old Testament and New Testament and the general problems with both those books.
I tend to agree with Bart Ehrman that about the very weak evidence supporting Christianity. What do you consider to be the strongest evidence supporting Islam? Well, there's three aspects. One, scientific accuracy of the Quran. Two, prophecies, or four aspects. I'm sorry. One aspect is scientific accuracy in the Quran. Two is prophecies of the Quran being fulfilled. Three is the miracles of the Prophet Muhammad, and four is the prophecies of the Prophet Muhammad being fulfilled in modern times. So I think those four aspects would be strong evidence for the validity of Islam, or the good arguments for the reliability of Islam, or why Islam is believable by prophecies and by fulfilled prophecies and by scientific accuracy of the Quran. And of course the miracles of the Prophet Muhammad and the prophecies of the Quran being fulfilled. So I think those four aspects prove Islam, or prove that Islam, or show that Islam is the evidence for Islam. There's good reasons to believe in the prophethood of Muhammad, but that's just me. Other Muslim apologists will come up with some kind of other arguments that I don't agree with, but that's fine. That's them. That's not me. My arguments are more based on prophecies being fulfilled and scientific accuracy and the miracles of the Prophet Muhammad found in the Hadith. So those would be the four arguments I would personally use to show that there's good reasons to believe in Muhammad, and there's good reasons to believe or to follow Islam as some kind of truth-bearing of faith, or evidence-based faith. In Christianity, I think the miracle claims are the most difficult to support with the evidence. Can you please explain why you consider the miracle claims within Islam to be credible? Well, it goes back to the reliability of the hadith. The hadith say the Prophet Muhammad performed miracles. We can trust the hadith because the hadith have chains of transmissions, or the hadith trace back to the disciples of the Prophet Muhammad who wrote hadith, and then they passed it on from generation to generation until Ibn Ishaq and Sahih al-Bukhari were written 120 to 200 years after the death of the Prophet Muhammad and his disciples, or Prophet Muhammad's companions who wrote hadith, like Ali, Ibn Abbas, Abu Huraira, all these early Muslim scholars, or these early disciples or companions of the Prophet Muhammad. They wrote hadith and they passed it on to generation to generation until until Bukhari was written, or Ibn Ishaq and Bukhari were written. So we can trust the sources of Islam better than we can trust the New Testament Gospels, because the New Testament Gospels, according to Christian scholars like Raymond Brown, Craig L. Blomberg, Michael Green, etc., say that the Gospels are anonymous, written by anonymous Greek authors who had no connection to Jesus and the disciples. So, how can we trust the New Testament if it's written by anonymous Greek authors who had no connection, who are not eyewitnesses, right? Like, none of the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John contain any kind of credible eyewitness. So why should we believe in these New Testament documents? That is the question that the Christians really need to explain to us, which they have utterly failed to do, because even Christian scholars, like even Michael Licona, is admitting that the Gospel of Matthew has made up legends in it. So why should we trust? You know what I mean? Like, why should we trust the New Testament when even Christian scholars are admitting that it's written by unknown authors and there's made up legends in there? Why should we believe in them? So that's the question that Christians have failed to answer for the last, I don't know, 2,000 years, is why should we believe in the New Testament documents? And this isn't like something new. Even like pagan critics of Christianity, like Celsus, rejected the Gospels. They say, Celsus and other like pagan critics of Christianity back in the first, second, and third centuries rejected the New Testament. They said these gospel writers were inventors, not historians. They were making up stories that contradict themselves. Like, if you read Mark, Matthew, and Luke and John, all four of these gospels contradict themselves on who Jesus identified himself as, the resurrection narratives, what happened in the crucifixion. So there's contradictions in these gospels, and the critics like Celsus, in the first or the second century, rejected the gospels because they knew after reading it that these gospel writers were not historians, but they were inventors, or people making stuff up about Jesus and the disciples. Thus, they were fictional accounts. They're not accurate biography accounts, even according to critics of Christianity like Celsus, like these pagan critics. They were saying that they were rejecting the New Testament, as having stories or legends and not biographical facts about Jesus. So even these pagan critics rejected the New Testament back in those times. So I think they had good points, because if they rejected it, why should we accept it? And their reasoning was pretty good for rejecting the reliability of the New Testament Gospels. Okay, Havel Amin retracted his message. That's fine. That's fine with me. I don't really care. Yeah, let's go on. Let's go on for like 10 more minutes, and then I'll draw this to a close. So, any other comments or questions? Let me know. Greetings, I hope you're doing well. If Jesus did not die on the cross, as some beliefs suggest, then who was the person who was actually crucified in his place? Well, I believe Jesus was crucified, but I believe he survived the crucifixion. And that explains the Quran, chapter 4, verse 157. So, I mean, all the historical evidence shows that Jesus was crucified, but none of the evidence demands that Jesus died on the cross, even by naturalistic means. So, just because Jesus was crucified doesn't mean he died. It's possible he survived by supernatural or natural means. What happened after is that when Jesus was put in the tomb, he was taken from the tomb into heaven. So that explains the empty tomb. Because if you read the post-mortem vindication of Jesus in the Saints Gospel Q in the empty tomb by Daniel A. Smith, he proves that according to the Q Gospel, Jesus was talking about his disappearance, not his resurrection. And the resurrection was added later by Paul. Paul was the one who made up Jesus' death and resurrection. To see Galatians 1, 2 Corinthians 11, etc. So Paul and the disciples got into fights with one another, and Paul was the one who made up Jesus' death and resurrection, not the disciples, because I believe the disciples were adhering to the Q gospel. Further, we see that Dieter Zeller argues that according to the Q gospel, the sign of Jonah was talking about Jesus' rescue from death and not his death itself. So according to the Q gospel talked about Jesus being rescued from death and his disappearance, and Paul is the one who made up Jesus' death on the cross and his resurrection out of the tomb. So that explains. So that's where the death and resurrection of Jesus came from. Paul, not the disciples. So there's some serious problems with believing that the disciples believed in Jesus' death and resurrection, when in reality they were probably adhering to the Q gospel, which talked about Jesus' rescue from death and his disappearance as opposed to his resurrection. Paul's the one who made up Jesus' resurrection, not the disciples. So my take is different from traditional Muslim commentators and traditionists when they comment on when they try to explain the Quran chapter 4 verse 157. My view is a little different. On a less serious note, can we see your comic books up there? I don't see anything very modern. Do you mostly collect read more vintage? Yeah, I mean, I collect and yeah, so these are my comics. Yeah, I mean, I like the older stuff, the older Amazing Spider-Man, the older Incredible Hulk, the older like the 1960s, 70s, 80s, 90s comics, Marvel comics and Image or Spawn. I like the earlier stuff. Modern comics are just stupid now. They're like woke bullshit, and I don't like that. Like I like the classic stories, with Spidey facing, Venom. See, I got the cover appearance of Venom right there. Oops, right there. See, it's Amazing Spider-Man 316. I like the older stuff, the stuff that Todd McFarlane drew and Stan Lee wrote. From the '60s, '70s, '80s, and '90s. I like that older stuff when Spider-Man was fighting, Hobgoblin and Green Goblin, and Spider-Man was fighting, the Punisher and all that stuff, and like the older like Todd McFarlane, like when he first broke into Marvel, he was doing Incredible Hulk and Spider and the Amazing Spider-Man. And there's some really good stories and art in McFarlane's books, and just like the '90s, '80s, '70s, '60s stuff. I think comic books got bad by the 2000s. They weren't as good as they were in the '90s, etc. Especially Amazing Spider-Man. That's the only one that I tried to keep up with. But in the 2000s, like the Amazing Spider-Man run wasn't that good. It wasn't as good as it was back in the '90s, '80s, '70s, '60s, etc. So I mean, I love comic books. I love uh, you know, Amazing Spider-Man. Like Spider-Man is my favorite character of all time. I love Incredible Hulk, Fantastic Four, anything comic books like DC, Marvel, Image. I love all that, and that's part of my business. I run a business where I buy and sell comic books on eBay. These older books from the '60s, '70s, and I've made a lot of money selling comics. So that's my side business. I run a online eBay store where I sell Magic cards, Pokemon cards, and comic books, etc., etc. So that's just my hobby, I guess, outside of religious apologetics. So yeah, you can see I have the Death of Superman that's sealed. By the way, Fantastic Four Annual #2, Amazing Spider-Man 136, second appearance of Punisher. I have the issue where Silver Surfer or what do you call it? Carnage fights Silver Surfer and Amazing Spider-Man. That's a crazy issue right there. I got Spawn #100. I got Spawn #1. I got tons of those books. Incredible Hulk 340, where Wolverine and the Hulk fight each other. So I love all that stuff. I got the black suit, Secret Wars 8, with uh, Spider-Man having the black suit. First Prowler, Godzilla. I love comic books. I think these are not only good stories, but they're a part of history, right? There's a part of, like, Spawn #1 will be a part of history where somebody broke out of Marvel and DC and made their own comic book. So I think Spawn #1's a piece of history. I think Death of Superman right there is a piece of history too, because Death of Superman, like back in 1992, was like all over the news. Death of Superman back in 1992. There was a that book in that dramatic black bag sold like millions of copies, and people were just going crazy over that Death of Superman comic from the '90s. So it was a big deal back then. The Death of Superman. So I think comic books, they're a part of history. They're a part of like American history, and they're good business. I always sell comic books in comic book conventions and eBay, so I think they're good business too if you're looking for a little side hustle. But yeah, I mean, I love Marvel, DC. I love comic books. It's just one of my hobbies, I guess. That and collecting Pokemon cards and sports cards. Yeah, I mean, I don't care. Yeah, I mean, I do want to wrap this up. I do have other things to do, but if anybody has any other, I mean, you can always be on my channel or drop in comments and questions, etc. I try to respond to everybody on my channel, except the trolls. I just block them because I don't have time to deal with them. But yeah, if anybody has any last questions, or if anybody has any last comments, etc., go ahead and leave it there. I'll continue this for the next 3 minutes. So we're at 45 minutes. 48 minutes, I'll end this live stream. So go ahead with your comments or whatever on the chat. And yeah, let's wrap this up because we've been going on for almost an hour now. Which Quran translation would you recommend for someone interested in learning more about Islam? Yusuf Ali, the Yusuf Ali translation. Also, are there any particular books you can recommend on the problem of theocracy in Islam? No, no, I don't know. I don't know any books. Sorry, you can look it up, but at the top of my head, no, I don't know any. I don't recommend. I don't know any books on the problem of theocracy in Islam. I just don't. Okay, so we're right at 48 minutes. I think it's time to wrap up. So thank you guys for your questions, your comments, and letting me talk about my comics. Yeah, I'll do this more often. Maybe like every other week or something. There will be a live stream. So thank you so much for joining. And yeah, let's close this out because I have other things I wanna do, or I have other videos I have to edit, so I have to spend time doing that. So thank you guys so much for joining tonight's live stream, and have a good night.